Let's take this show on the road. Same-ish, different day. I be bored out my mind. Hometown, love my place.
Hey friends, let's dye some yarn. Today we are going to dye cotton. I've got 4 skeins of Pima cotton here that we're going to use to dye. And the thing with dyeing cotton is that it is a completely different process compared to dyeing wool, because it is plant-based. So we will be using soda ash and water to make sure the dye adheres to the yarn. And that's actually all we need. We don't need to heat it up or anything, but we do need to soak it first. Water and soda ash. And once that is done, we can pick up the yarn from the soaking bath, and we can add dye, and then we just let it sit for at least 12 hours. And that's it. So to start, we are going to add water into this big tub. You do not need such a big tub, you just need one big enough to so that your yarn is completely soaked. So I'm going to add in 2 liters, and again I'm using metric measurements. I'm going to add in another one. I think that might be enough. Maybe, or maybe we should add one more. Let's do 6 liters. Just to make sure we have enough water to completely soak the cotton. And there we go. And now we're going to need about 60 milliliters of soda ash per liter of water. And this measuring spoon is just about 60 milliliters. So we're going to need 6 of these now. Let's see, do we have a full spoon here? Almost, not quite. Need to open the other bottle. There, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, oops, and then some, and 6. I'm just going to stir that so that it dissolves properly. This is what is going to get the dye to adhere to the yarn. And when dyeing cotton, you cannot use the same type of dye that you use for dyeing wool and animal fibers in general. Plant-based fibers need a different type of dye to be able to adhere to the yarn, or it won't stick. Lumps up a bit here and there. See if we can find it. Now we're going to prepare our yarn. I'm going to open the skein. Just shake it a little to loosen the strands. And I put a zip tie on each one. It makes it easier to keep them from tangling to themselves and to the other skeins. There we go. And that's 2. And 3. And the last one. I'm using reusable zip ties. Highly recommend. You can find them on Amazon. There you go. Let's stir this a little bit more. Let's see, there are some clumps in here. That's okay. So the soda ash is mostly dissolved. There's a little bit left, but it will dissolve on its own. Tip is to use not completely cold water. It will dissolve easier. And we're adding in the cotton. I'm going to use a spoon to push it down, to soak it completely. All the yarn needs to be completely soaked. There's a strand of hair. It needs to be completely soaked in order for the dye to adhere to the yarn, or it won't stick. I'm just pushing it down here. Usually I'm just gonna be using my hands to push down the yarn, but since we're working with soda ash, I prefer to use a spoon. Cotton takes a while to soak properly. Just gonna push it down like that, and I'm just gonna let it sit for at least half an hour to soak, and then we're going to dye. Now we are ready to dye. I've let the cotton sit for a few hours, so all of the soda ash has dissolved completely and has been soaking for a couple of hours now. We got our pan that we are going to dye in, measuring cups. I got the dye. Since this is a plant-based dye, we need to use a reactive dye. So I got this one from Dharma, and I've chosen the Robin's Egg Blue. I got a small, tiny yogurt pot that I'm going to use to mix the dye into water, and then I'm going to add it to. I'm going to put water in these. I'm going to add the dye to those. I've got a tiny spoon for the dye, something to stir with. This will help me mix the dye to the water. Another old yogurt pot filled with water that I can just stick my spoons in, and face mask to protect my airways, because you don't want to breathe in this dye. It's a very, very fine powder, and some gloves. So what we're going to do now is we are going to first mix the dye with some water, and then mix it into these two, and then we are ready to start dyeing. Now we are ready to mix the dye. First, put on the face mask. We grab some dye. This is what it looks like. It's not often that the color of the powder actually corresponds to the finished results. I'm going to add just a little bit to the pot. Very bright blue. Let's mix that and see how we feel. I'll just put that in order over there. I think this will look good. It will be diluted, of course. I have put water in the measuring cups, saving some space for the dye. So we're just going to add that in. I'm just splitting 50-50 on a, more or less. There we go. Just stirring slightly. Okay. And now we are ready to start dyeing. The first thing we're going to do is to place the soaked yarn into the pan where we are going to dye it. And I'm putting on gloves. And we'll just pick up the skeins, squeeze out a little bit of the water. And we're placing it in the pan. And since this is cotton, we do not need to use heat to set the dye. It will set anyway. The chemical reaction between the dye and the soda ash will make the dye stick to the yarn anyway. So instead of heating it, you add the dye and then you let it rest for 12 hours at least. Yeah. Now let's add in the dye. I'm just going to pour it over. And these measuring cups hold 2 liters each. They're pretty full. There we go. I'm just going to use the spoon to press the yarn down into the dye to make sure I get dye everywhere. I'm going to go in with my hands, push it down, and I'll be covering this pan while the dye is setting. I got a lid that fits these pans, but you can also just use plastic wrap to cover. I'm just turning them over a bit to make sure everything gets dye. There we are. And we're just working with cold water here. No water, hot water at all. There we are. Now we're just going to let this sit for at least 12 hours and then we can rinse it. It is time to rinse our cotton. And let's see what we got. Just take off the lid. There we go. Looking good. We're going to use cold water. And I'm adding some soap, as I always do, what I prefer. You can use whatever you prefer. You can use dish soap, you can use shampoo, whatever. Soap you don't really need to rinse more than once. I usually do it twice anyway. If you use anything else, you'll have to rinse it several times to make sure you get all the soap out. I'm just going to turn this so I can reach the ties. Zip ties. I'm using a plastic container for rinsing my yarn. You don't really need to do that. You can do it directly in the sink or whatever you got. But I prefer using this. There we go. And now we're just going to pick up the yarn. Squeeze out some excess water and put it in the rinsing pan. It does have some it has taken a bit differently. It's not even all over, but it actually looks good. However, I thought I saw something on the last one here. Let's see what we got. No, maybe we're good. Thought maybe I had spilled a different dye on one of the skeins, but I think we're good. There we go. I'm just going to pour this out. There we go. I'm just pressing down to rinse the yarn. I'm using gloves because I don't like how my hand feels when I have been dyeing with soda ash. It's just this really weird soapy texture. Let's see if we can catch the first one. There we go. I'm just going to dunk it in the water. This is a dye that has not spread evenly over the yarn. You can see there are more dyes in some spaces and others that haven't gotten as much. This happens sometimes. Squeezing out the water. And I'm not twisting or wringing the yarn, just squeezing the water out. Ah, there we are. That's what I thought I saw. Tiny speck of pink has snuck in on one of the skeins. Happens very easily. So be careful when you're dyeing. And make sure you avoid that. There we go. Pour out the water. I'm going to rinse the yarn one more time. It's still a very light summer look. And I kind of like it anyway, even though it didn't turn out perfect. Sometimes it just doesn't. I think this will look very nice in a summer top, an example. Maybe I'll just leave in that pink speck and call it a design, conscious design. Who knows? Anything is allowed when you're dyeing for yourself. There we go. I'm going to remove my gloves. There's no soda ash left in the water now. Let's see if we can catch the... There we go. One last rinse. Squeezing the water out. Some use a salad spinner to get all the dye out, all the water out. I just prefer to use my hands and just squeeze it out. And the third one. And the last one. So this one came out a variegated minty green, I would say. And like I said, I think a nice summer top, sun-kissed skin. I think that's going to look really, really good. I'm going to hang this to dry. I just dry my yarns on a regular clothes line or clothes rack. So it'll take a couple of days to dry and I'll be back with the finished result. Here's the finished result. It turned out to be a slightly variegated minty color, very summery. I am for sure going to make myself a top from this to wear this summer. I think that is going to be really lovely. Please let me know if you are dyeing cotton yourself. I would love to see it. So by all means, tag me in social media. Both the yarn and if you knit something with your hand-dyed yarn. I would love to see that as well. So thank you for coming along, and I'll see you in the next one.